to both Dr. Keisha Blain speak and read from her book, and then you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. I am Dr. Terry Ann Scott. I'm the director of the Institute for Common Power. The Institute for Common Power is hosting this event. We are a nonprofit organization that is an educational branch of Common Power. Common Power is a Seattle-based organization that mobilizes volunteers for voting, started in 2018. We started the Institute for Common Power in 2022 because for people to understand the gravity of the vote and how it is tied to everything from water to employment to our lived environments, and education, we must understand the history. And so I am a former professor of African American history, and the Institute focuses on that history and thinking about how we historicize our modern environment and move people from education to action. And so we lean very heavily on renowned scholars to be able to help us to deliver those messages, not only of what we have done in the past and how it impacts us today, but of hope. And so we are very pleased to have Dr. Keisha Blain here with us, to have her back with us. She delivered a beautiful message and a lecture for us in the spring, and we have an upcoming anthology, and she is, of course, a contributor to that. She will be speaking today about her latest work, Without Fear, and which I have right here, Black Women in the Making of Human Rights. And so before I say anything else about Dr. Blain, I want to mention that per her request, we will be giving free copies of the book to a number of our educators who are in our system. We go on Truth and Purpose learning tours, many per year through Georgia and Alabama, Tennessee and Mississippi, and we give scholarships to K through 12 educators from around the country to go on that journey and learn truth. And so we will be giving copies of her book to those educators. Dr. Keisha Blain is an award-winning historian and professor of Africana Studies and History at Brown University with a PhD from Princeton University. She is editor-in-chief of Global Black Thought and the author of multiple works, including Until I Am Free, Fannie Lou Hamer's Enduring Message to America, the seminal work on Miss Hamer. And she is here, as I mentioned today, to discuss her latest book. Dr. Blain, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be back.
Absolutely. Thank you. And so I think before we begin to talk more about the book, I have some questions for you. We are encouraging people in the chat to please put your questions there so that we can relay them to Dr. Blain. You are going to treat us to a reading from your latest work.
Yes, I will read a section from the introduction. The uprisings of 2020 sparked a national and global conversation about the significance of Black women in movements for social change. In grassroots demonstrations across the world, Black women occupied a central role in the crusade to end state-sanctioned violence and anti-Black racism. Utilizing public spaces such as city parks and busy streets, they advocated for equality and justice while calling on others, regardless of race, gender, class, ethnicity, sexuality, religion, and nationality, to join the fight for human dignity. From activist Tamika Mallory delivering an impassioned speech on the history of racial violence before a crowd of protesters in Minneapolis, Minnesota, to Black Lives Matter co-founder Patrisse Cullors promoting the growing movement to defund the police, Black women were at the forefront of the protests sparked by the police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and too many others. Though some at the time marveled at the sight, the prominence of Black women in these protests were not a sudden development. By taking to the streets to advocate for human dignity and global justice, these activists were building upon a long tradition of Black women's human rights advocacy. Without Fear, Black Women and the Making of Human Rights tells these women's stories. It unfolds a sweeping history of the lives and ideas of a group of Black women in the United States to explore how, for well over a century, they were at the forefront of the struggle for human rights. While the term human rights means and has meant different things to different people, the women featured in this book generally understood it to mean divinely inspired protections guaranteed to all people by virtue of their humanity. To that end, These activists and intellectuals embrace three core elements of human rights philosophy: a focus on natural rights, inherent in all humans, universality, meaning applicable everywhere, and equality, the same for all people. They framed their demands not only as citizenship rights tied to a particular state, but as concerns for human rights that extended well beyond the borders of an individual nation. For them, the struggle for rights and freedom in the United States has always been inextricable from the struggle of all people to attain the liberties and rights guaranteed to them regardless of their social status, nationality, and identity. Much of our understanding of the history of human rights has been shaped through a focus on diplomatic relations, international laws, nation states, and non governmental organizations. Without Fear offers a different perspective, capturing human rights thinking and activism from the ground up, with mostly excluded actors at the center of the narrative. By moving across the local, national, and global, the book depicts the dynamic interplay of these ordinary individuals, often invisible, with the public officials, mostly white and male, who have dominated the discourse on human rights. Looking at these women raised a host of questions. What does the struggle of human rights look like from the perspective of the marginalized? How did these individuals draw inspiration from the concept of human rights to challenge racism and white supremacy in their community and beyond? How did Black women in the United States work to advance the universal and inalienable rights for all people at home and abroad? How did Black women influence or attempt to influence the debate over human rights from outside the halls of power? How do they work to ensure that the core ideals of life, liberty, and security would be extended to all? Without Fear offers a window into the everyday application of human rights among an often overshadowed group of activists and intellectuals in the United States. In standard and mainstream accounts, the history of human rights is told primarily through the ideas of white men, European philosophers and thinkers such as Friedrich Nietzsche and Ernst Troels, and organizations such as the United Nations and Amnesty International. These intellectuals and institutions have all fundamentally shaped human rights history. Research, however, reveals a wide array of activists and leaders from all walks of life who contributed to this long term project. Without Fear highlights an overlooked group in the development of human rights as a force for change. Centering Black women in the United States is not meant to place them above others in a comprehensive history of human rights. Indeed, a diverse constellation of historical actors in various locales, especially in the Global South, have contributed much to our understanding of human rights as idea and as praxis. My goal in highlighting Black American women is to illuminate how a historically marginalized group effectively made human rights theirs, moving beyond an esoteric concept to an organizing principle that fueled local, national, and global activism. The women who take center stage in this book, some eminent and notable, and others who worked in relative obscurity for all their lives, labored to redefine the rights and dignity of all people, and they did so, in the words of African American educator Mary McLeod Bethune, without fear and hesitancy. Thank you.
I'm sure others at home are clapping and it worked for you as well. Thank you. I knew you were going to do a book reading, but I did not know what section you were going to read from. And I love that you read that because I was honored to be able to receive an advance copy of the book some time ago before this talk. When I opened the page and started reading from the introduction, exactly where you began, the fact that you are talking about this watershed moment in our country and in our lives in 2020 instantly drew me in because people recall this fracture in the country. They recall this pandemic that laid bare these health disparities in race, all of these protests, and you delve right into that. So the first thing I thought about while reading that was wondering how much, if any, that particular historical moment served as an impetus for the work, if it prompted you to further delve into any of the lives. How did these 2020 moment, how did that impact the writing of this book?
Yes, thank you for that. I think the 2020 protests certainly brought on or emphasized for me the significance of this particular history that I needed to tell. And so it brought on a sense of urgency.
Mm,
That's certainly the case. But it's also the case that the 2020 protests, I think, really captivated or captured rather the crucial role that Black women play in leading social and political movements. I was struck by the fact that in 2020, that particular year, many journalists reached out to me to say, can you talk about what's happening? Can you offer the historical context? But even more so, can you tell us about the significance of Black women being so central in this
mm,
moment? So, and many times the way they phrased the question, they were presenting it as though this was new.
mhm,
And so I spent a lot of time reflecting on this. Well, what exactly is new and why did it seem new to many people? And I think part of the answer to that question, and you know this as a historian, is that a lot of the, I think, work and leadership of Black women, uh, quite frankly, tend to be invisible,
mhm,
very effective, but invisible. People don't often see the work. And so to have someone like Tamika Mallory on the television talking, or that moment where she's giving this fiery speech, I remember seeing the coverage of that speech as just one example. For some people, it seemed quite new to have this moment of Black women in these visible roles, or the work of the women, the Black women who helped to establish the Black Lives Matter as a movement, all of these things. And part of what I was arguing then, as I argue now, is that it's not new. And in fact, these women are building upon a longer and rich tradition of Black women's advocacy, and specifically human rights advocacy. That's the part that I think a lot of people missed. At the end of the book, I talk about having Ayo Tamedi, formerly Opal Tamedi, speaking at the United Nations as just a pivotal moment that captures how in 2020, and then how, and even before, how Black women were using these spaces, and Black women as leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement were using spaces like the UN to make an argument that state-sanctioned violence was in fact a human rights abuse. So all of this was happening in real time, and it connected so powerfully to the story that I knew I needed to tell. Um,
mhm,
and I was in the process. Essentially, I started writing this book as I was working on the book on Hamer. I was in the process of trying to finish the Hamer book. And then I was also writing this other book. And in truth, I tend to write multiple projects at once. It's simply the way that my mind works. And part of the connection to Hamer was really grappling with a phrase that she said. She said multiple times, I'm no longer fighting for equal rights, I'm fighting for human rights. Or put another way, no longer fighting for civil rights, we're fighting for human rights. And part of it was her attempt to say that it's not about necessarily rights guaranteed or recognized by the US government. Of course, that's important. Of course, she's interested in those rights. She's talking about the importance of voting rights. So we know she's interested in civil rights. But even more so, that what she is asking for is in fact the kinds of protections that should be due to her simply because she is human. And
mhm,
that reframing is something that she points out, and it's not unique to her, but it's something that really captivated me. And I wanted to be able to explain exactly what's the relationship between the two. How are Black women conceptualizing human rights? What are
mhm,
they doing to advocate for human rights? And when do they begin to do that work? And as I started digging into the research, it took me all the way to the 1830s, and to the writings and speeches of Maria Stewart in Boston. So this has really been a remarkable journey. to pull these women's stories together, and the 2020 protests being, I think, a fuel to that fire. For me, recognizing that I needed to write this book.
Thank you. While you're speaking, you mentioned the unfortunate invisibility of Black women. And I think that's one of the things that makes your work so unique and so important. When we walk the streets of Atlanta, for instance, when we're taking groups, we see this beautiful mural of Ella Baker. And most people in the group don't know who Ella Baker is. And we know that in the historiography of civil rights for so many years, until very recently, it was very much a male-dominated historiography that ended in Memphis with King's assassination.
Mhm.
And you have been a scholar who very much has pushed against not only the periodization of that historiography, you're talking about going to the 1830s, but also making sure that women are visible in this. And so, first of all, just as a general thank you, I think I can represent everybody who's out there to say, and we point to your work all the time in our work, to say thank you for making sure that the work of Black women is heralded in the historiography and now in the public mind. And then in this book, which I loved, you can actually see my Haitian flag over my shoulder. I have it there always, so I didn't put it there just for this. My mother's from Haiti. And
Mm.
so in reading this and seeing Haiti discussed in here with Madam C.J. Walker and others, I was taken aback. And I think a lot of people will be, because you are exploring not only the work that they did here in America, but on this transnational kind of platform, the global work of Black women for human rights. Can you talk to us about doing that? And what were some of the more kind of surprising connections that you found?
Yes, and so I mentioned earlier just the reframing of the narrative. That's something that I knew I needed to do. And so I opened the book with, in chapter one, I opened the book with Ida B. Wells. And I did so intentionally. Of course, I discussed Mariah Stewart a bit later, right? But I opened with Ida B. Wells because I knew that as soon as people heard the name, they would think, oh, well, of course I know Ida B. Wells, right? A very important anti-lynching crusader. And perhaps they would think there was nothing more to say about her.
Mhm.
And what I do in that discussion is I talk about how she's drawing the connections between what's taking place in the United States and what's taking place globally. Yes, we know that she travels to the UK in the late 19th century. I certainly talk about that. But I focus specifically on the way that she is a very important human rights thinker in the 19th century, and how she is, in fact, both talking about the need for government protection. Certainly, she's meeting with President McKinley. She is talking about the need for the US government to do right by its citizens. That is certainly one of her arguments, but it's not the only argument. She is then thinking about these broader concerns, the importance of Black people being treated with human dignity, the importance of really the United States recognizing that they are withholding rights that everyone should have because these are God-given rights.
Mhm.
So that conversation is happening. She's drawing connections to Cuba. She's
Mhm.
talking about lynching in the same moment that she's then discussing the Armenian genocide. I mean, these are things that I didn't hear other scholars talk about in
Mhm.
any depth. And so it was important for me to grapple with this and to show how Ida B. Wells is someone who's thinking transnationally and globally, right, at this moment, as she is doing the work of challenging racial violence and pointing out the hypocrisy and all of that. And so, to the question of Madam C.J. Walker, this is another example of someone that we know, but we know in a very, I think, specific context.
Yeah.
People would mention in the scholarship, well, she did travel through the Caribbean and Central America to promote her hair, right,
Mhm.
company and to explore new markets. So that's the way it's been phrased and emphasized. And that is true. She certainly did that. But what I wanted to focus on was what she did when she arrived in many of these places. So to Haiti, as an example, in Haiti, She certainly did explore markets for her company. She certainly did have conversations with people about the work that she was doing and her business. But she also spoke to Haitian politicians. She met with Haitian elites. She had important conversations with them about what was happening in Haiti. In 1913, as she's traveling through Haiti, she makes the decision to visit prisons, which is something that she does intentionally because she's concerned. She's concerned about how people are being mistreated simply because they are speaking out.
Mhm.
And so she's talking to political prisoners who find themselves in a situation where they are locked up because they're speaking truth. And I
Mhm.
think, especially in this moment, we understand. I think we understand what this means. And part of what she does is she tries to raise, I think, global, international awareness of what's happening in Haiti. When the U.S. occupation of Haiti breaks out, she is among the group of Black Americans who condemn the occupation. So just as examples of how she's not solely to be, thought of as the self-made, as this is the term used often, right? The self-made millionaire who's thinking about Black hair, like all of that matters, but she's also doing the kind of human rights advocacy at a very early moment. I'll briefly say too that I also discuss her work with the ILDP, or the International League for Darker Peoples, in 1919. We know that she helped to establish this group. In fact, the first meeting that the group comes together in her living room in her home. So we know that. But I talk about how behind the scenes she plays a critical role in helping to organize a meeting between members of the ILDP and Japanese delegates
Wow.
who are getting ready to go to the Paris Peace Conference. And so it is so important to see how these women were thinking, right, about what's happening at the local, about what's happening nationally, but they're also thinking globally, and they're making concrete steps to draw these connections, and they're doing all of these things decades before Black women have full access to the vote, right? Decades before the establishment of the United Nations, decades before the Universal Declaration for Human Rights from 1948. So I'm trying to get people to see that you can't talk about a human rights history, ignore Black women, and imagine that you have the whole story.
Creating and executing their own political power when theoretically they have, not theoretically, actually
Right.
had the absence of political power. And I hadn't thought about this. I hadn't made this connection until you just said this. But while Madam C.J. Walker, she's speaking up for those who are in prison for speaking truth. One of my relatives, the writer, Haitian writer Jacques Romain, was actually one of those
Oh.
imprisoned for that.
Mm,
So,
mm,
which is a legacy of, we have a lot of pride over him
yeah.
speaking truth. It is a moment that today, when we think about what is happening in this country, and I'm not going to ask this yet, but as we kind of get to a closing, I want us to have a conversation about the ways in which these women inspire us and teach us today. So I'll put that on hold for a moment. And if anyone has questions, please drop them in the chat. But I do want to have ask you something that's kind of related to that. You talked about Madam C.J. Walker. You talk about Ida B. Wells
Mhm.
and well-known women. And I fret in saying well-known because many people don't really actually know much about them. They've just heard the
Right.
names. But you also present a number of women about whom we have never heard. And
Mhm.
so, two things. I'd like for you to maybe discuss one or two that you would like people to know about. Tell them, some. I want them to buy the book and learn more. And number two, were there women in the book with whom you in your personal life identified and felt a particular connection to?
Yes, both great questions. So, to the first one, I discuss a woman by the name of Pearl Sherrod in this book.
Mhm.
And if anyone is listening who might have been following my work for some time, they know that I've been very interested in Pearl Sherrod for a long time. I actually, I think, first started thinking about Pearl Sherrod and writing about her when I was writing my doctoral thesis. So it's now been more than 10 years. And then I wrote an article about her in Souls, I think in 2015 or so. I mentioned that because at the time when I wrote the article, um, I certainly utilized everything that I had, but I remember thinking I would love to come back to her. And so over the years, now, wow, 10 years, I just kept digging. I just kept digging. Just every time I thought of her, I would do some more research to check, to see there a new database in the census record that might have popped up in 10 years that I missed? And the answer is yes.
Wow.
Some things popped up that I hadn't seen in 2014 or 2013. So I started just continuing to build that archive personally and because I knew that this was a story I wanted to tell and
Mhm.
return to. And I'm thrilled that I was able to gather enough to be able to talk about her in this book. And so I talk about Pearl Sherrod, and she is a working class Black woman. I talk about her primarily in the context of Detroit in the 1930s. But as I
Mhm.
explained in the book, she was born in Alabama. At one point, she was living in West Virginia, so she's moving. But I started in the 1930s in Detroit because, in many ways, it's truly the beginning of the story of how she enters the space, both in terms of the history, but how she captured my attention, and she captured my attention when she showed up in 1937. She travels to Vancouver in Canada, and she shows up at a Pan Pacific Women's Association conference. And so this is a group that's very interested in cross-cultural dialogue, women across well, so broadly Pan Pacific region. But we're speaking about primarily white and Asian women or women of Asian descent. And they had a gathering in Vancouver in 37. Pearl Sherrod was not invited to this gathering. She was not on the program, so to speak. But what she does is she finds out this gathering is taking place and she decides she's going to attend. So she shows up at this conference, and for all intents and purposes, she crashes the party. She walks to the front, and it's just fascinating when you look at the primary sources, the way people describe this. They talk about how she's dressed, and she just walks up to the podium and she starts
Yeah.
speaking. And what is she speaking about? Well, thankfully, it's captured in the primary sources. One, because so many people write about it
Mhm.
after, and then there's even journalists cover the story. And so I'm able to get parts and pieces of the speech. The speech is essentially saying to attendees, you're not going to be able to accomplish any of your goals if you don't actually think about what Black people are dealing with, which is to
Mhm.
say, your whole conception of human rights. And to be clear, as I explained in the book, women are thinking about human rights and talking about human rights even before the term becomes popular in everyday lexicon, right? So part of what I'm doing is I'm going far beyond human rights in quotations. And the question I asked in the writing of this book is, well, what exactly are human rights? What are the core principles? I read the excerpt to explain that. And once I could pinpoint the core principles, then I went back to see, okay, so where are women talking about these core principles? So
Mhm.
just to give context, right? So when I say she's giving this human rights speech in the 30s, but she's telling these women that their whole vision, that it's incomplete without a consideration of Black women and certainly Black people, not only in the US, but across the globe. It's quite extraordinary, this speech. And it's not just that the speech happens, and I think those who know me, I love intellectual history, so I would obsess about a speech all day. But I will say it's not just about the speech, but it was about what the speech ultimately changes, right? What it shifts in the history. What we do know, because it's documented, is that following her speech and her presence at this gathering, things change within the organization, which is to say that future conferences would then open up a space for
Wow.
Black women, right? So you think about what it means for this working class Black woman who doesn't have an invitation. Nobody knows who she is. She shows up, she gives a speech. There's a record of the speech. People are so moved by it or so captivated by it that it actually leads to changes at the organizational level. That's just one example of the kind of human rights activism that I'm capturing here. Truly grassroots,
Uh,
but extraordinary, I think.
I absolutely adore that. There has been a meme going around on social media lately that says, "Where is a woman's place, a Black woman's place?" And it says, "Wherever she wants it to be." And that's the first
I
thing I
love that.
thought of. Imagining this woman walking in, going to the podium, and taking up her space to say, "This is the message that I have to put out." When we think about what lessons we learn from history, boy, is that not a fantastic one.
Yeah,
So do not wait for the invitation because it may never arrive.
absolutely. And then you asked me about a woman who I might connect with in some way.
Mhm.
And so I'll mention another person who happens to be lesser known, um, who I do connect with in many ways. And granted, I will say, I there are always differences. I don't think there's anyone who I write about who I agree with 100%. So I want to
Mm,
be clear,
right there.
but Margaret Cartwright is someone who I write about in the book, and I would say I introduce her in the book because um, there's just simply nothing yet. Um,
Mhm.
prior to this book published about her, apart from maybe a reference here or two. But this book, I'm thrilled, was just a wonderful opportunity to tell her story.
Mhm.
And one of the reasons that I resonate with her is because in the 1950s and 60s, she was a college professor. She was a college
Mm.
professor at Hunter College from of the city of New York, the CUNY system. And at the same time, she was a columnist. So she's both teaching, a sociologist, so she's in the sociology department, and she's writing for the Pittsburgh Courier, and she's also writing for New York Amsterdam News. Just those two things,
Sound a lot like
as
you.
you know, exactly. I think those who know me know that I just love to write, and I did have a column at MSNBC, and maybe we'll talk about perhaps the challenges of doing that kind of work. And I chose to pull back for various reasons, I think both personal and political, but nonetheless, I think I felt a connection to Margaret Cartwright because I saw myself in her and just the way that I've always been trying to speak to multiple audiences at once and never seeing that as a contradiction, just seeing it as something that I'm committed to. I do care about scholarship. I do want to be in dialogue with scholars, but I don't want to stay there. And I'm frustrated when I'm only staying there. I want to be talking to people who have no PhD. I want to talk to people who don't have much formal education. I love those conversations because it forces me to break it down, right? It just forces me to be clear
Right.
I love it. I love when someone's like, well, what do you mean exactly? And
Yeah.
that I can grapple with the question and explain it. And I think that's what we need in my mind. What's the point of knowledge, right? If we can't actually share it and if people can't understand. So to the story, she's also traveling across the globe, and she's traveling intentionally. At one point, she's a correspondent for the United Nations, so she's attending various meetings, she's going to significant gatherings. She attends a 1955 Bandung conference. Anyone who studied Afro-Asia or Afro-Asian solidarity and the history will understand the significance of Bandung. It's probably the most, and some would argue, the most significant gathering for, certainly leaders of African descent and of Asian descent. And she goes to this gathering, but she's there to observe, to take notes, and to be able to go back and write about her experiences and share her ideas with an American audience. She does the same thing in 58 when she goes to Accra, Ghana, and she's with Kwame Nkrumah and so many other influential African leaders. She's not on the program, right? In a similar way, she's, as Pearl Sherrod, she's not on the program. No one invited her to give a speech, but she's such a significant voice in that she listens, she gathers, she goes back, and she interprets, and she writes columns to help people understand the significance of this gathering for the Black diaspora. Why should Black people in the U.S. know what's going on in Bandung? She spells that out. Why should they know what's going on in Accra? In 58, she spells that out. So all that is to say, a lot of the things that she's doing, it certainly resonates to the things that I'm committed to. And there's a lot of work that I'm doing that I don't necessarily showcase, but part
Mhm.
of the things that I do is I'm constantly in dialogue. with policymakers as just one example. And so
Mm.
I've been doing just multiple projects behind the scenes, and sometimes I've even organized events with people around policy, just because I think those are the kinds of conversations that need to take place alongside, right, all of the scholarship and everything else we're doing. So Margaret Cartwright, I see myself in her at the same time. To my point, I want to put the disclaimer because I think when people read the book, they'll read aspects about her life and they might think, well, she said she resonates with them, with
You're
Margaret
like, not
Cartwright.
everything.
Not everything. But absolutely, she is such an important figure. And these two examples alone help us understand what human rights history looks like when we are able to center Black women's stories, Black women's
Yeah.
experiences. It looks very different, right? It's not a story about the United Nations per se. It's not a story about diplomats, not a story about people with certain positions, but it's about everyday people, from coming from different social backgrounds, coming from different parts of the country with different skills that they bring to the table, knowing that change is possible, believing it's possible, not
Mhm.
being so worried about this notion of having a seat at the table, right? And that's something that I think about a lot. We always say, well, we want a seat at the table, and fine, that's important. But sometimes some of these women, they weren't even worried about that. You don't have to give me a seat at the table. You don't even have to let me in the room. I will
Amazing.
still do what I need to do. And it's so inspiring, And of course, there are challenges, as you can imagine. This is not a happy-go-lucky story.
Right.
There's a lot of pain in here. There are a lot of disappointments in here. But I think it's the kind of story that's important to know, especially as we think about our current moment.
So many fantastic things. First of all, questions are pouring in, and you have, as you're talking, you've actually answered some of them. So I'll kind of pull some of the pieces out from there. But you are just illuminating so much of one of the things that we focus on at the Institute for Common Power is the idea of how does history teach us something? And so you are telling that it is not about just reading the stories to know the facts and know the information. It is really about how does it help us navigate challenges in our own lives, and the stories of these women in the way that you have presented them and the portions of it that you have chosen to present very much allow us to take this and use this as a tutorial in many ways. And you yourself embody education action. I did not know that you meet with policymakers. Somebody asked, what about the people who aren't going to read this, who need to read this? Well, it sounds to me like you have a pathway for that if you are meeting with those policymakers. So bravo, that is
Yes, yes. And I will say too, many people may not be familiar with this, but I worked on an edited volume that came out 2024
Mhm.
called Wake Up America. And it's essentially, I brought together a group of Black women and asked them, influential Black women, and I will say too, um, just as we're thinking through this and we're talking about policymakers, one of the individuals who I worked with for this volume was now sadly the late Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. And it's it was just a remarkable, I think, opportunity to be able to talk to her then, but to talk to others about the future of democracy, essentially. Where are we headed? What exactly do we need to do? So it wasn't just, okay, where are we headed, as in, okay, things are taking place and we have no control, okay, because I want to reject that. But more so, what steps do we need to take to ensure that we're building a more inclusive and multiracial democracy, that we build the kind of society that we want to see for ourselves, but also for our children and our children's children. And so, and I asked her to talk about it through the theme of reparations, which is, something that she was deeply committed to. So I just mentioned that as one example of the work that I've done
Mhm.
is try to be in dialogue, even in that sense. It's a collection of essays, but it's just another way. So to that question about getting this information, one of the reasons why I did that project, um, while I was in the process of doing many other things, is because I knew that not everybody would necessarily pick up the book and read
Right.
it. But what's nice about that collection that I mentioned, they're very short essays. 2,000 words or less, and I really conceptualize them as op-eds, but even perhaps even more in-depth, detailed footnotes so that people can follow up to find the information they need. And so that volume is an example. But to the point, it's one of the reasons that I write shorter pieces. One of the reasons why I'm constantly doing, I'm always willing to talk to documentarians, and I'm always willing to do these kinds of projects. And as busy as I am, because I recognize that some people will not read these books, and some people may not read these articles. There are some people who will only hear me because I've done an interview on the radio, or and I do receive emails, I receive letters from people often who say, I heard you talk about the history on this particular show, and I didn't know that, and that meant a lot to me to understand this history. I appreciate that, but that's why I'm committed to doing it, is because I think it's important to break free from the walls of the academy. And as I said,
Yeah.
I'm an academic, right? I'll always be an academic,
Mhm.
but I'm more than that. And to the point, I recognize that the problem with the academy as we've constructed it is that it ultimately keeps a lot of people out.
Yeah.
And there are some people who simply will not be able to take a class with me at Brown for a
Mhm.
range of reasons.
Mhm.
I want to make sure that I can still get the information out to them. And so even for those who are here, I will say I recognize like I'm not covering every or all the bases. There are so many other ways to share the work, and it doesn't just fall on me. I would say that this is a collective endeavor.
Mhm.
And if you've read the book and there's something in it that's meaningful to you, maybe it sparks an opportunity to have, um, who knows, a conversation at the very least. There are people who say to me, your work inspired me to come together for a book club, but to the point, if everyone's not going to read the book, they may not want to join the book club, or maybe it could just be a series of questions that
Yeah.
the book inspires you to ask within your communities, within your churches, or other religious spaces, or other kinds of communities of which you're a part. So I hope that it opens up opportunities and it doesn't limit. I hope that it opens up the conversation as much as possible.
I love that. And Dr. Blaine, that is why we love you here so much, because the not only idea, but you put it in practice of being able to make this information accessible beyond the walls of the academy is exactly the work we are engaged in here. And so this is why, when we first connected,
Yeah.
the entire organization said we adore her, because there's a like-mindedness and an understanding of what is needed to get done for the greater good, and how do we extend beyond just having a conversation that is scholar to scholar and writing just scholar to scholar, but the information
Right.
that matters to others. So we appreciate that about you. And there's also something about you that is an inspiration. And so it is not only in the women about whom you are writing and their stories, but the fact of how you get all this done. I'm just going to ask a practical question. I know that you are a mother of small children, that you
Mhm.
are still currently teaching right now at Brown while you
Mhm.
are promoting this book and having book talks. I also know that you are quite prolific, and that when we
Mhm.
asked you for an essay, for instance, for the anthology, I think you had it to us in a couple of weeks. And so, what would you say to people out there who say, I have this and I have that, or I don't have time for this, or I'm trying to balance everything? How are you making it happen in your life?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I will say too, it's a struggle, and one of the things that I'm grateful for is having different kinds of help. And so even and I recognize that in and of itself is a privilege in so many ways, to have a spouse who's willing to jump in, whether it means to make dinner, to watch the kids, and I'm grateful for that, and to be with someone who has said to me, "Do what you need to do. I'm fully invested in supporting your career."
Mhm.
That's truly a gift, and I don't take it for granted. So that really makes a difference. I will say too, I've tried to get into certain kinds of habits, which when I say this too around my writing.
Mhm.
I write every day, with the exception of weekends. I commit to writing every day, and it doesn't mean hours, but this is something that I learned from Carrie Ann Rockamore and
Mhm.
the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity. which is something I learned as a graduate student, and thankfully I was able to carry it through all these years. It means just 30 minutes a day. Sometimes I'm able to do more, which is wonderful, but I commit to 30 minutes. And most of the time it's 5 o'clock in the morning, quite frankly. It's, or 4:30, when you,
Really
especially
quickly.
exactly when you have small kids, they get up early too. So, early. You
Mhm.
can't imagine that you'll be able to do much when they're up and about. So really the strategy is to do what you can while they're sleeping. And recognize that even just a little bit, I can tell you 30 minutes a day uh, throughout the course of a semester, for example, sometimes I get to the end of the semester and I've written 30 pages, right? And it's not that I had one day where I had four hours. I don't think I've had a 4 hour writing day in a long time.
Right.
Probably a writing retreat or something,
You
but
may not
it's
until
just,
right
it's
till they're
not
nice.
happening. Exactly. It's not happening, with the amount of things I think on my schedule and the demands on my time. But just 30 minutes a day in the course of 15 weeks, I'm able to write a lot. And I mentioned earlier just doing multiple things at once.
Yeah.
That helps. That helps. So I tend to it's interesting to say this, but I feel like I have a short attention span. So what that means is that if I'm writing something, I'm working on a long-term project, sometimes I'll have a thought, oh, wait a minute, I want to do a book on something, or oh, that's another question. And so I just create these folders, like, okay, drag this here, I'll come back to it later. And then if I'm writing something, I'm deep into writing and I have an idea and I think, oh, wait a minute, that connects to that other project I've been dreaming about. I'll just quickly go and add it to that folder. So I have all of these folders, all these unfinished projects. So I always joke that people think I'm so prolific, but I have more unfinished projects
You're
on my
still very
computer
prolific.
than completed projects. But it's okay. It's a process. It's with time, and really, I will say all that. Ultimately, you have to be um, you have to be patient with yourself. You have to be kind to yourself and recognize that things won't always move the way you want them to move. And part of what I've tried to do is quite frankly take it one day at a time. I have a plan, I have
Yeah.
goals, I have a vision, but I don't know if today will be the day that I get a call that my son's not feeling well, and then then I can't do four other things. And
Mhm.
and there's no sense in stressing about it. It just means that we have to respond in the moment. So you do what you can when you can. But I do think to the patterns, you have to have some kind of pattern because
Mhm.
I find that when you have it, and the consistency will yield results a lot faster than this sort of, well, I think I'll work on a book when I feel like it. It's just, if you take that approach, it's just not going to get done, quite frankly. So trying to come up with systems and also I mentioned help, it's great when you have it. But I've learned the hard way that sometimes you need to ask for help. I'll
Mm.
say that. I think sometimes there's a sense that, okay, we can carry it on our own. We could do it, we'll do it, we'll get it done. But knowing when you have to reach out to someone and say, listen, I am overwhelmed this week, can you watch the kids? Can you do this? Can
Yeah.
you and also not being a perfectionist, not being too hard on yourself. And I've dealt with this. You can't cook a wonderful meal every night. Like you might want to, but
Yeah.
pizza's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Right. I love this. I feel like, an unexpected treat to come in here for a book talk and people got some
Yeah.
life coaching as well. So this was really fantastic advice. And the consistency, yeah, that makes perfect sense because
Right.
sometimes we think, okay, I'm going to do, whether it's a writing project or something else, I'll have this
Mhm.
one whole solid day and it may not work out. But if you can do a little bit each
Yeah.
day,
Yeah. I think that's the key. And I've done different type, I've done writing groups, and there are moments where you do need the writing group for accountability, and there are other times where I just couldn't do the writing group because it added another layer of anxiety to make
something
them
else.
do it. Exactly.
Right.
I'm like, forget it. I just want to do my 5 a.m. thing and I'm done.
Yeah.
5:30. I don't want to talk to anyone about it. I just want to do it. So you have to figure out what you need. And I will say, lastly, run your own race, honestly. I sometimes get frustrated, when and this is true in the academy, but it's true in every context where it's tempting to take a look at what this person's doing and oh, where this person's publishing.
Worry about that.
I just I don't worry about it. I just kind of say, okay, if this door opens, I'm gonna walk in it, and that's it. Like yeah, I might have liked to be able to publish here or there, but the time spent stressing out about that, I could be doing something else, and life is short, so you got to move. You really do, and so I hope that helps someone. You do the best you can, how you can, when you can. It's good to be inspired by other people, but don't feel like you need to do what they're doing.
Words of wisdom. I think you are helping people. I'm seeing people comment in the chat. That is beautiful. I know we don't have much time left, so I have a few kind of rapid fire. I'll give you a few questions. What organization, somebody is asking in the questions and answer, what organizations do you recommend who are doing pro-democracy work right now? I'm going to give a shameless plug and put ours out there first, Common Power
Yes.
Institute, but go ahead.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say, and it's great. I think for those who are here absolutely know this. So this is wonderful. I will mention just as a national organization, I
Mhm.
think a lot about the NAACP as
Yes.
an example. So I will give them a shout out here, simply because at this particular moment in our nation's history, with everything that we're facing, it's not that utilizing the law is the only tool, but it has been one of the most effective, I think, in this moment. I was actually talking to someone recently who said to me that they had lost significant funding. I think it was like an NIH grant, and that they were, very big grant that they lost for some of the work that they were doing. And then I was saying, I'm so sorry. And I said, well, actually, I was able to get the money back, and I was able to get help, various groups, including folks from NAACP were supportive, and they were able to file a lawsuit, and they were successful. I remember thinking, I want to hear more of this, like please,
Yeah.
because the framing around this is, well, you lose the funding and it's like, there's nothing to be done. But I was struck by this person sharing this with me, but to the point, it made me think about how significant this organization has been remarkable and quite effective for such a long time.
Mhm.
And of course, we were talking about Ida B. Wells earlier, so the connections are here.
Yeah.
So that's one. The other, and the other thing I'll say too, since I've already given a national organization as an example, I
Mhm.
do encourage people to think about what's happening locally.
Mhm.
One of the things that I know I've been guilty of, and someone said this to me once, I was talking about donating different things, and I said, I'll go here, I'll go there. And they said, well, you've only mentioned all of these big organizations, and they get a lot of donations. So have you thought of this place right in the community, right in
Yeah.
your backyard, so to speak? And I had not. And I think that particular moment is one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, because it's so easy to see what's already grand and established. But the irony is, there are certainly organizations within, all of our communities that could just use a little bit of help right now.
Yeah.
And it could be as small as, financial donations certainly always go a long way, but just having people to support the work that they're doing. So even as we're talking about organizations, I would implore people, I'm saying organizations, but to be clear, a lot of this work happens in, right, an array of spaces, some political, some not, some religious, some not. So it is a really thinking broadly about how you can tap into networks that you have fairly easy access to, right, within your communities,
Right.
to advance this work, even as you're thinking about the larger organizations that are doing work at a national or even an international scale.
And don't wait for an invitation like the
Correct.
women in your book.
Mhm.
I love this. Thank you, Dr. Blain. The name of the book is Without Fear, Black Women in the Making of Human Rights. We dropped the link in there for people to purchase it. We will send a follow-up email with the recording of this, and it will also include the link. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this, we will be purchasing a number of copies to give to our institute, to several of our institute educator ambassadors. Dr. Blain, it is always such a pleasure to have a conversation with you. I hope you come back soon so we can do this again.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. And thanks to everyone. I know it's a difficult time of the day, but it's wonderful to have you all here.
Thank you. Thank you for just your work and your words of wisdom and your commitment to this
Thank you.
pro democracy work. So thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us. Have a beautiful